Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shou, the Education and Programs Coordinator at the Chinese Historical Society of America. Thank you all for joining us for Pacific Crossings with Mr. Robert Wells, where we have come together to learn about the important history about the strength, resilience, and survival of early day Chinese immigrants. If you have any questions for our speaker today, please let us know using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And a quick shout out to CHSA's intern Kimberly for helping out behind the scenes today. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Robert Wells. Robert is a retired US Navy captain with a distinguished 30 years of service, during which he was awarded 20 service medals and served in the Clinton and Bush administrations. Robert received an undergraduate degree in political science from UCLA and a master's degree in international security and foreign politics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Robert is also the author of Voices from the Bottom of the South China Sea. Thank you for joining us today, Robert. Really excited for the presentation that you'll be sharing with us.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and thank you, Kimberly, also for helping to bring this story to everyone. And good afternoon, everybody. And we'll go ahead and share my screen now so that you can see this story.
Robert, if you also want to start your video as well.
Okay. Is that prompted as well? Start video. Got it. There we are. And can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kimberly. And to the members of the Chinese American Heritage Foundation, thank you very much for this opportunity to present this very, very important history. And I'm going to talk about the Chinese that were looking toward California and looking toward crossing the Pacific Ocean during the 1868 to 1875 timeframe. And this is after the gold rush in California, when California was becoming better known with regard to opportunities after the gold rush, and also by stories that were coming back to China, to Guangdong province in particular, about their opportunities in California. My book, as Shou mentioned, was Voices from the Bottom of the South China Sea. And this book speaks to this particular Pacific crossing on the largest sidewheel steamships in the world. And our story begins today in San Francisco, and this was the destination for the immigrants, almost 100,000 immigrants over this 9-year period. We're going from Guangdong province, 2 key areas in Guangdong province, through Hong Kong and across the Pacific on these very large steamers. And the reason that many have not heard about this story is because during the 1906 earthquake in April of 1906, the earthquake itself and the following fire destroyed the records of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. And this was the parent company of these large steamers. These steamers had 4 primary steamers that were part of a vision by President Abraham Lincoln to establish the trade between China and the United States after the Trans-Pacific Railroad was completed. I was able to piece together through 4.5 years of research the story, what was lost in the earthquake, and I bring it to you now. President Lincoln, about 6 weeks before he was assassinated, approved a bill that would establish the Pacific Mail Steamship Company Trans-Pacific steamers. These were beautiful ships, huge ships. They were very, very much the pride of the United States. Looking at after the Civil War, having these steamers built, all these steamers were built in New York. They were built very close to Brooklyn, New York, at a location called Greenpoint, and also across the river in the East River area of New York. But these were significant steamers. There was no Panama Canal back then. After they were built and outfitted, they would sail around the Horn of South America, Tierra del Fuego, and then come up the coast to Panama, and then further up the coast to San Francisco. They became the Pacific Mail Steamships scheduled transit service between San Francisco and China through Hong Kong. And the 4 ships that we're going to talk about today for the Pacific crossings for your voyage today were the Great Republic, the China, the Japan, and the America. These were the largest sidewheel steamers in the world, built all out of wood, not iron. And they plied the seas for the 10 years after the Civil War from 1869 to 1875. And this is what they look like. This is the Pacific Mail Steamship Japan at anchor in Hong Kong Bay. You can see the Victoria Peak in the background there. And you could see from the bow to the stern, the bow area with forward of the smokestack was the area where the Chinese immigrants birthed, where they were actually, when they came aboard the ship, the contracted labor personnel from different locations in Guangdong province. This is where they birthed. The ships could hold up to 1,200 passengers, immigrant steerage passengers in the forward part of the ship. And the forward part of the ship was 3-tier high, so that they had the berthing almost up to the overhead. And this is where they had their voyage across. It took approximately 33 days in these surroundings on board these vessels to get from Hong Kong to San Francisco via a coal stop in Yokohama, Japan. And they were moving at a very swift pace of 9 miles an hour, or 9 knots, 10 miles an hour, heading across. You could see behind the smokestack, you could see the lifeboats aft. And this is where the first class passengers were berthed. And this is also where the women were berthed when they came aboard the ships to make the passage from Guangdong through Hong Kong to San Francisco. These were 1850s technology that had riverboat side wheels. The size of that side wheel right there that you see in red is approximately 50 feet in diameter. And right behind it is the rocker arm. There's a single arm that would be use steam at 20 pounds per square inch, 20 PSI, to move the side wheels so that the ships would make way across the Pacific. This Pacific Mail steamship also had class as a price point for people that were first class passengers would be berthed in blue. And what that meant is that they were closer aft, as you could see on the bottom diagram, closer aft to the lifeboats. They also had for the merchant class, the men and women that were aboard, they also had restroom facilities on board in their berthing areas on the after part of the ship. And these were in the lower spaces, the midsection of the ship, and as well, they had access to the social saloons, as they call them, on the upper decks of these sidewheel steamers. For the labor and the steerage class, they were dispersed mostly forward, but you can see in the red color, they were up forward and along the port and starboard sides. And that's where they had their berthing areas. And I've got some additional pictures that show, again, the enormous amount of space that was needed to bring over the immigrants, and also the type of voyage that they had, how they ate, what they ate on board these ships as they transit and made their Pacific crossing. After the Pacific crossings, where did they take their first steps? Were the ones I write about in my book, as well as my research indicates on these 4 key ships, over 40,000 Chinese immigrants from Guangdong took their first steps. And their origin is very important for the history between China and the United States, and in particular, the history of Guangdong province and the 2 different regions in Guangdong province that were the beginnings of this great immigration from 1869 to 1875. They also call them the Sojourners, or the wild geese generation. They were people that wanted a better life. They wanted to go and to have that better life through their labors and return to China. They're also the ones that came across that helped build America, that established the Chinatowns, that worked in the mines, that built the railroad, especially the Central Pacific Railroad, worked at the grottos up in Napa Valley, and created commerce in the United States through their labors. The two districts, the CIAP, or the laborers districts, and I have a chart that I wanted to present to you all that really puts all this research together, and it's historic in terms of it being able to describe this immigrant experience. So the CIAP provinces were Sunhui, the Toishan or Taishaners, Hoiping and Yanping. The Toishaners were about 75% of this immigration group. And then they have the Samyap, which were the merchant class around Guangzhou in Canton, as it was known. And they were from Namhoi, Punyu, and Shuntak. Hong Kong was the important destination, so that they would be declared as labor immigrants coming for free passage of their own free will from Hong Kong, not Macau, which was the Portuguese colony that shipped people under indentured servitude from Macau to the guano pits of Peru and the cane fields of Cuba and other locations in the Americas. So Hong Kong was our free passage focal point for the Guangdong wild geese generation. Now, the Pacific crossing, as I mentioned, took about 33 days to get across, and you can see right where Hong Kong is on the left-hand side there, and over 40,000 is what I've been able to account for in my research on these ships, 100 round-trip voyages on these 4 ships, 33 days to get across, a speedy 9 knots or 10 miles an hour. Once they departed Hong Kong, you can see they went up the coast, past Formosa or Taiwan, outside into Yokohama, Japan, and that's where they loaded up coal. These ships took 1,500 tons of coal, used 50 tons of coal a day, and they couldn't make it round trip. They had to stop in Yokohama, Japan to get additional coal. And you're talking about 7,000 nautical miles, and they made an average of 216 nautical miles per day. They always had to be concerned not only about the coal because of its potential to spontaneously combust on board these ships, which were all wood, but also the weather. And they had the southwest monsoon season, which included your typhoons, and the northeast monsoon season, which were your northeasters, as we call them, off of Boston. But this occurs also in the East China Sea and the South China Sea during the wintertime. So you can see the Pacific crossing. You could see it from Hong Kong to Yokohama. They followed the 30th parallel line coming across into San Francisco. So their first steps, once they got to San Francisco, many of you probably saw Buster Posey last evening hit a home run against the Los Angeles Dodgers over the right field pavilion, landing in McCovey Cove. But if Buster comes to bat tonight and he hits another home run and it goes over the left field pavilion, and it's got distance and it bounces about 20 times, it will come to rest in that red circle area. And that circle area is where almost 100,000 of the Chinese immigrants from Guangdong province took their first steps after their Pacific crossing to San Francisco. It's a very historic spot. It's before 1882 exclusion. It's the 1870s. This is where the free labor contracted Chinese had their first steps in America. This is what the location looks like today. And this is what it looked like then. And you can see where AT&T Park is. There, it abuts the China Basin. That's why they called it the China Basin, because it had the waterway access for merchants to move materials between warehouses and between the docks. And you can see where the Pacific Mail Steamships pier were. This is an actual 1873 map of San Francisco that actually shows these two locations. During this last decade, it's been recognized the importance of Chinese contributions to the growth of the United States, the growth of San Francisco and also of California. And the leadership in San Francisco, led by Mayor Lee, recognized this on this particular spot where that home run ball would come to pass. And at that spot, you could see that Brennan Street, that was the foot of Brennan was the location of the pier. And this is a slide that shows the importance of this as ground zero along the San Francisco waterfront, which really does point to where Chinese immigration can be accounted for, and began with this scheduled steam service of the Pacific Mail Steamships. And this is also what it looked like at the piers and the docks. And you could see on that left-hand corner there, the arrival of another group of laborers, probably 1871, coming to San Francisco. The Pacific Crossing story is different and historic for one key reason. The research has discovered not only the ships that brought the Chinese immigrants from Guangdong to San Francisco, but the research also communicates to people of Chinese American descent, also in China, who the captains were on board these vessels and how many voyages they did and how many immigrants they brought under their command to safely bring them to San Francisco. So through research, we were able to find not just the ships, but the captains and the captains' pictures. And these were long obscured. They weren't in public knowledge, had been published before, but the book does account for, in particular, Captain Warsaw, who was the captain of the SS Japan, also the China, and Captain Cavalry. But we've got all the captains that brought everyone to America on these particular ships from Guangdong province. This is a very detailed slide that I provided to show, and the Chinese Historical Society of America, for everyone's benefit, that really shows how and where Chinese immigration began in the Siyi and Sanyi districts, who the people were in terms of their trades, either farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, railroad labor, the merchant class that came out of Nanhai and Panyu and Shunde and Guangzhou, also the Zhongzhan class of farmers that actually brought their rice techniques to the Sacramento Delta. So this is all part of this chart here that's worth studying. And also in the left-hand corner, as you could see, we've got the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Associations, the Uyghur, the 6 companies as they were known, that established themselves right after the gold rush to take care of the Chinese immigrants for the gold rush and provide benevolent services, food, shelter, so they could have them, and they were linked to the district they came from. So, and I know in San Francisco, in Chinatown, you still have the Sam Yup, established 1851. I think it's on Grant Street or just around the corner. And you also have Hop Wo. So you have different regions represented through their benevolent Uyghur Association. And you have Taishan, Xinhui, Zhongzhang, all these different regions that had support for their laborers. Another thing on this chart you could see is once they got down the Pearl River, and once they got to Hong Kong, as I had mentioned, they wanted to go through Hong Kong. They did not want to be part of what they termed the coolie labor system that would leave on Portuguese, Spanish, other vessels under different flags to Peru, to Panama, to Cuba for really slave labor. They wanted to go to the United States. Both the British Crown Colony and the United States had immigration restrictions legally to have free will immigration passage to the United States. On the right-hand side, This is direct research that shows the ships, the number of passages, and in dark black there, you can see the number of immigrants that made their passage on these vessels, these specific vessels. And then finally, the Chinese Customs House. You can see the years I did my research, 1867 to 1875. This is 3 confirmed sources. These are the arrival and departures of both male and female that came to San Francisco collectively, and most on these Pacific Mail steamships. So I provide this to the Chinese Historical Society of America. This was historic research itself, and I hope everybody enjoys it and is able to ponder and contemplate using this particular slide. Before they crossed, they had to make these decisions at home in Guangdong, why they had to leave their village, why they had to immigrate. And a driver of that desire was their intent to have a better life for themselves, for their family. There were some individual decisions made with regard to labor contracts, working with labor contractors, and there was also family decisions in the village to make with regard to contracting with the labor representative to pay the passage and then working it off over 3 years' time. It would usually be about $45 to $50 in gold that had to be in the possession of the individual laborer to get their passage, which included food, which included transportation when they were in San Francisco to the different labor destination. But all this was negotiated in Guangdong before the passage. Also, the 6 companies had negotiated with the Pacific Mail Steamship companies before they took Chinese immigrants or Chinese people from China, the guarantee that if they passed away or they were buried in America, that their bones or their body would be returned to China on the Pacific Mail ships so that their soul could be released to heaven in Confucian and Tao tradition, because the Pacific Mail Steamship Company could guarantee that. And they did. They held up their word, and they brought bodies, they brought bones back. They coordinated that through the 6 companies on board the ships to come back home. But all this immigration couldn't happen without that agreement, as well as these decisions that had to be made there in their home villages. Pardon me. Also, as indicated, before anyone left and got aboard a U.S. vessel, they had to have a certificate that stated that they were a free will. And for the researchers that are listening to this presentation today, these are all in the National Archives back in Maryland. And I could give you the actual drawer they're in. There's quite a bit of information. It's enough for another book, both on terms of Chinese immigration, as well as women, as well as trades. It's all there in the State Department records, which had these particular certificates because the United States and their consulate, because of the law, and the United States was coming out of the Civil War and the fight, as President Lincoln provided the Emancipation Proclamation, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, about freedom and about equal justice for people, that the people had to come to the United States of their own free will, and they had to certify that through their labor contract negotiator or individually. There were a lot of dangers at sea as well. So they had not only to certify themselves in Hong Kong to make the passage, but as I mentioned, the coal was a concern. And the coal for captains used to be called the coal fiend, and it had to be managed. It couldn't be wet. They had to aerate it, because if you didn't aerate it and it's in a hot, confined space, you'd have gases form and the coal would get hot, as it would create a circumstance where it would spontaneously combust. Well, 2 out of those 4 ships had spontaneous combustion of coal. One, the SS America, as you see on the right-hand side in 1872, had a coal fire in Yokohama, Japan, and 82 people were lost. The worst one in history, though, was the SS Japan, the one I write about in my book. It caught fire, coal fire, spontaneously combusted at midnight. It had 537 passengers aboard. Only 137 survive. Over 400 of the Chinese immigrants returning home just 12 hours from Hong Kong perished at midnight because of coal. The ship burned in 45 minutes. So it's a tremendous loss of life. But to get to America, they had to have, after they paid their $45, they had to be properly berthed. You saw the ship at anchor in Hong Kong. They got on. They had their belongings with them. They had also their different musical instruments, different dress and attire that they were going to bring to America. All this was part of their luggage, if you will, as they got a rack or a berthing, and you can see they're three high where they would sleep. And if you remember that picture, there's up to 1,200 of the Chinese immigrants would be in the forward part of the ship. So here they are, that's their berthing compartment, and they would be there for 33 days for the passage to San Francisco. They had to eat also, and you can see on the left-hand side about 100 of the Chinese immigrants being checked in with their meal tickets to be able to go up in the mid deck there to actually have their daily ration on board the ship. You can see the Pacific Mail Steamship steward right behind the meal ticket foreman, representing his particular group, providing the meal ticket to the agent there before they were allowed into the midsection to have their meal. Once they got to the midsection for their meal, rice was an important staple that was cooked on board the ship. Also, the immigrants did bring vegetables, dried vegetables, dried food stuff where they could put hot water on it and have that with their rice. So if you had up to 1,200 people on board, that would be 12 servings in a mess like that. So you could see with this particular group that they would eat, and then if you can see out that passageway, they would go up to the topside area for air, and another group would come in behind them. Throughout my research for the Pacific crossing, I've also looked at trying to find color so that you could see what color the clothing was, the labor personnel wore, also the uniforms the Pacific Mail Steamship Company personnel had on board. When they arrived in San Francisco, you could see the color of the different labor groups coming down the gangway there, but they also had to be checked for customs, for contraband, for opium, for non-authorized material goods coming in. You can see the gentleman in the top hat there is a customs agent. You also had the San Francisco police there. And on the left-hand side, you can see an undertaker, because this was part of the agreement to make sure that if somebody had passed away on board, that they were properly taken care of, working with the Benevolent Association or with the labor leader, so that they can return them to China or keep them in the United States until they were ready to return on the next vessel. The passage of women also was a very important development on board these Pacific Mail Steamships. And you could see in this 1869 Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, you could see the women in their native attire, different colored clothing representing their different districts as well. You could also see the commotion on the pier. You could see the male laborers that were either from the ship or from the representation up on Jackson Street in Chinatown, looking at getting the Teamsters wagon out of San Francisco. Their interest in the women as well. You could see the law enforcement authority there from San Francisco police trying to maintain order as well. So, but this is all part of the immigration that occurred. This is about a month before the Intercontinental Railroad at Promontory Point was joined. The immigrants had contributed for the past 5 or 6 years for the Central Pacific Railroad, and this Pacific Mail Steamship had a natural, a scheduled 4-ship scheduled to go back and forth to China. So this was emerging and further developed trade during this period of time, bringing the women over to San Francisco as well. And these are the steamships underway here, and this is the actual Pacific Mail Steamship China. And this is a very important ship for the Pacific crossings history, because she not only brought tens of thousands of the Chinese immigrants to the United States, she also brought the first Chinese delegation, the legation that established diplomatic relations in San Francisco. And that, of course, is part of the Burlingame delegation. Ambassador Burlingame was President Lincoln's ambassador. He saw China as an important nation and wanted to make sure that she was treated fairly. He requested to be resigned from American Foreign Service and became the ambassador from China to the treaty powers. He worked with Prince Kong in the Qing Dynasty to become that ambassador. And this ship brought Sun Tajen and the Chinese delegation to America in March of 1868. Also, across from San Francisco in Tiburon and Belvedere, the only remnant of these four ships that's still above water, called the China Cabin, is over across the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge in Tiburon, right adjacent to Angel Island. And it's worth a visit because you can actually touch history here. You can actually see where Prince Kong and the Qing Dynasty was transported from China to the United States, representing China to the treaty powers. And you can also touch where many members of the Guangdong merchant community, likely in first class, had their time up in the saloon, which is the China Cabin. Now here's the Burlingame delegation. You could also see the flag of Prince Kong and the Qing Dynasty there, which is the yellow backdrop with yellow banner with the dragon. But you see that Anson Burlingame is the center ambassador, but Sun Tajen and his delegation of 10 were the ones that came to the US, met, took the railroad across, the new Trans-Pacific Railroad, and also the chance had a meeting with President Johnson in the White House, so that they established the agreement between the United States, called the Burlingame Agreement. And you get another picture, it shows the dock area. This is a big deal in America, a big deal for China as well. And this is the United States standing up for China as an honest broker against the practices of the British, of the Germans, of the French, and the Russians that took advantage of China. And the United States just wanted trade for the most part. They wanted to actually establish trade. They had to work through the British and the treaty ports as well, and they had to work with the Chinese government. There was also missionaries that came from the United States that the United States wanted to have missionary practices in China and work with the Chinese government at that time. They came on these vessels as well. They traded in the different locations. The missionary work was done on these vessels. These were all part of the Burlingame Treaty and also the 14th Amendment of the United States, which talked about equal treatment for peoples in the United States, and it was part of that Burlingame Treaty language that allowed the free passage of Chinese to the United States. Now, the China is a special ship, and she didn't last, and this technology changed with screws. And this is a picture of her in her dry dock in Hunters Point. And across the way there, you'll see her being broken up right near Belvedere, not too far away from Angel Island, because she was just old. She was old technology, and 10 knots was not good enough. And the new screw steamships could bring you across at 13, 15 knots. And the technology just got better and better. And you also had a transition from coal to oil. They endured a lot in their Pacific passage across, and fire was the most tragic part of the Pacific crossing. And these immigrants that were in 1874. So it's already 6 years after Burlingame. The railroad's been completed. You've got 537 passengers on the SS Japan. They were going to go home. They were all in the forward part of the ship. They had $300, $400 in gold with them. They were almost home, as I mentioned, 12 hours. And they're going to go through Hong Kong and go back home to Toishan or head up there to Guangzhou. But right about 11:45 in the evening, the wind's blowing northeast monsoon. It's December 17th. And there was a cry of fire and the bell started ringing and they couldn't see there was any fire at all. And there was a lot of smoke going on and everyone manned their fire stations. They did get some water, fire water from the pumps going. However, the fire became out of control and the fire cut the escape. The Chinese could not get from the forward part of the ship back to the lifeboats. They jumped off in the midnight sky when the wind's blowing into the sea. And in the morning, the tale was told. The ship was gone. Only 137 survived. Only 5 of those lifeboats got off. So over 400 perished on board, the largest loss of Chinese immigrant life in American and Chinese history. You've got some representatives from Guangdong province that are Americans that all can trace their lineage back to Guangdong province. The former US ambassador to China, Gary Locke, current representative Judy Chu, and of course the late San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee. This is important history though. And this is a tragic, tragic circumstance. Some term it the Titanic of the East, where they lost their lives almost at home, this time by fire, not by ice. And we know where the location is of this wreckage and also of the tragedy that cut the ship in half. In 45 minutes, she was gone. And here's her final resting place, about 130 miles to the east of Hong Kong, 20 miles south of Shantou. I'd like to get an expedition to go back to the wreck site also, but that's to be determined. Here's a modern map that shows the Guangdong location again, east of Hong Kong, south of Shantou. 2 pieces, a small piece, which is the side wheel, a bigger portion, which is the body of the hull that exists off of Guangdong. Now here's something I ask all of you to, maybe you know somebody. These are the actual names of the Chinese survivors I have. I have the Ng family. I have the Chao family. I have the Leong family, Wong family, names that are accounted for, and I can trace them back to the actual disaster. But what we're trying to do, and my colleague Joyce Chan, who is also in San Francisco, is trying to do, and she's been to China and been to Hong Kong and also to Toishan. We're trying to locate a member of the Ng family, the Cha family, the Leong family, the Wong family, to say, oh yes, my ancestor was on that ship. I remember that. Because on the other side, we have, I do know where the great, 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 great grandson of the captain of the ship, Captain Warsaw, resides in New Hampshire and also in New York. There's two different parts of their family who actually have the actual captain's watch and some other decor that was presented to him while he was in command of the Japan. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, when Buster Posey hits that home run, you know where to go. It's going to be about 20 bounces over the left field fence at AT&T Park. It's going to land where almost 100,000 of the Chinese immigrants came to America, their first steps from this period of time that I describe in my research, that contributed greatly to America, both in the buildings of the railroad, Napa Valley, Chinatowns, plural. And this is a place that is hallowed, and Mayor Lee in San Francisco was trying to provide more information about where this location and the meaning of this location has for Chinese Americans and for America. And if you want to touch that piece of history, the China cabin across over in Tiburon, this is what it looks like. You can actually go there. You can actually feel uh, Ambassador Burlingame and also Sun Tajen. You can feel the merchants that came from Guangzhou. Those 4 ships that we've described for the Pacific crossings discussion, the Japan sunk, America sunk, Great Republic, the other one is sunk also in the Columbia River. And it was after its service, Pacific Mail was bringing passengers to Portland, Oregon, and it got caught on a midnight tide at the Columbia River bar, was broken up by waves, and her remnants are there at the mouth of the Columbia River. And then finally, the China, the only piece that's still above the China cabin across at Tiburon. So I thank you very much for your time today. It's an honor to present this. It's been presented in 17 cities over 50 times. People really have responded well to not only the story, but the history, which means a lot to me as an author to be able to bring it to the Chinese American community in the United States. So with that, that concludes the presentation of Pacific Crossings. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll go back to Show and Kimberly for chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for this spectacularly well-researched presentation and for making that historically embedded, but also very fun connection of the topic at hand to the Giants Stadium. And to everyone in the audience, if you have questions for Robert, please send it our way using the Q&A function. And in the meantime, Robert, what really stood out to me um, in your presentation was how you were able to map out all the various locations of where Chinese immigrants came from, like that of Taishan and Nanhai, and made me wonder that maybe the ingredients of a shared hometown, a shared home province, a shared profession was maybe even essential in building the foundation of our sense of community in the diaspora. I mean, 33 days together in the middle of the ocean with your countrymen, all who just like you would have all these ideas, ambitions, dreams, hopes, anxieties, maybe even regrets and longing. These all of these ingredients together might have made the ship a very interesting place for conversations, ideas, and more importantly, making friends on a vessel that's taking you further and further away from home. And so I really appreciate all that you brought um, to the discussion today. And so to kick off the Q&A, let's jump right into what our wonderful audience has kind of asked. So Anju is asking, why were the Sojourners called the wild geese?
That was a figure of speech from the research. It was discovered that the people that wrote about history at that period of time, since most of my research was the primary source time from the 1860s to 1870s, they termed them wild geese. It was a term of description because people during the Taiping Rebellion in China and also the Chinese culture itself, they were told not to leave China. They were told, do not go from China and to stay in China. And these people in Guangdong province, in particular the Toishan, life was very hard. And if you looked at the what happened with the Taiping Rebellion, what also happened with the farming and the availability to live, they had to do something. So they were quote unquote the wild geese, as was in the Sojourners, as were characterized by people that were describing this migration. Because after the migration became real with the steamships, they brought all these people to the United States, and you had cultures clash of civilizations, cultures clash. You had Chinese culture, American culture coming from the East after they built the railroad. You had economic jealousy, all the bad things of human nature that came part of it. So people were very curious. Why are the Chinese coming? And now that the railroad is done, we have our own population to take care of. And obviously you had other bad things start to occur with regard to politics and racism that are part of the reaction to the ships bringing all the Chinese here. Not unlike today with immigration pressures and the forces of support or the forces of don't bring any more people here.
Thank you, Robert. And Anju wanted to follow up and ask, so was the wild geese mostly a derogatory term?
I don't think so. I think it was a descriptive term. I think it was one that was provided based on the writer. I think the writers themselves uh, they're American writers. And I think listening to people, they interviewed people. In fact, my book has quite a few of the interviews. Why are you coming to America? Why did you leave China, and so forth? So I think the writers themselves in the New York press in particular, but also San Francisco press, the daily Alta, the Call, it was a characterization. It wasn't derogatory. I think it was also part of, they used to term it the oldest civilization in the world and the newest republic, America. And there was a sense of benevolence, especially in this period of time with Ambassador Burlingame's delegation, and a lot of hope after the Civil War in America, after the Civil War in China with Taiping, in the Qing Dynasty, Qing Dynasty with Prince Kong.
Thank you. And on that note about your book, we have a question that's asking if the charts and illustrations that you've shown us are included in the book too.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And I'm going to work through the Chinese Historical Society of America. You've got some of those key slides, but also for other questions in the future. But I found it. I'm just like a storyteller. I found it, and I want to share and make sure the history is complete because that's what I wanted to do.
Thank you, Robert. And we'll make sure to drop a link to your book again in the chat for those who would like to take a look. A question from Steve. Steve is asking, how many months worth of wage average per family did they have to save up for the deposit and for the entire passageway?
That's a great question and hard to determine because most of the $45 to $50 that was required was loaned. It was a loan from the 6 companies, or it was a loan from the labor contractor themselves who worked with the 6 companies. So they would loan the money and they would work it off. They would get the passage, they would get their meals. They got to San Francisco under a labor contract. So it took them 3 years, 4 years to work it off, and also they made $300 on average. And many of them on the ship that I wrote about had it around their neck when they're fire and they jumped off into the sea, tragically, but that's how it was. Now, if there was any village collaboration to gather money together or to gather collateral together, you could see that in one of the pictures where they were making deals with the labor merchant there to assure that the contract the money could be provided to whoever the laborer would be. Sometimes it would involve, the children as well.
Thank you for your answer, Robert. We have an anonymous question. Why were there so many of them from Taishan or Hong Kong and not from other parts of China? Is it due to British rule of Hong Kong at the time?
It's a great question, and primarily yes, since Hong Kong was the trading area, and if you look at the history of U.S.-China trade in particular, the Pearl River Valley and Whampoa was the primary destination for American trade with China through the British. Now, the British established the treaty ports after the Opium Wars, which occurred in the 1840s. Hong Kong was the primary port. The transit passage from Shanghai or that northern area was more difficult. They had U.S., British, other carriers that would go from north to south, but the actual hopping off point or hopping on point was Hong Kong.
Thank you. A question from Edith. What do you consider the most difficult hardship that the passengers go through during the voyage?
I think the most difficult hardship is probably one of longing for it's really a mental longing of home, and you're not getting there fast enough. 30 days is a lot of time at sea, and it's rough. I'm a sea captain. I've been in the South China Sea in the Northeast monsoon. It takes that mental discipline to basically say, and determination to do it. But I do think that they miss their families. They also long for a better life and hope it's true. So it gives you a lot of time to think as you're going. Also, you're trying to survive. You're trying to survive. All your fundamental instincts as a human. You need food. You need to have to have shelter. You need to have friends as well. Many themselves were part of groups that were coming across. They worked exceedingly hard uh, to go across the Pacific. Also, you see all the drills. It's a different culture on board the ship. You have a different type of discipline on board with your schedule. Time is very important at sea. You have to when reveille or the time to get up happens, you get up. You eat on time. You what they call douse the glint. You turn the lights out, so you got the evening steam, and the crew feels good about that, so no one falls overboard. And you're always looking at fire, so you're not in control. Is I think to answer Eve, you're not in control, and you really have to adapt and overcome, and you have to all those things you're thinking about. Those are all part of us as humans, but I would just have an empathy for those that were passengers.
Thank you. Another question from Steve asking, did the trafficked young girls come from the same ships? And did they know that they were going to be trafficked? And if there are any records of these young girls?
The answer is yes to everything. In fact, it wasn't just this one ship, it was all the ships. It was all four of the ships. The ship I read about, the Japan in particular, had the most famous of the transits. They knew they were being trafficked to different locations in Chinatown. They were not affiliated with the six companies, but other nefarious traders in Chinatown. This trade was being brought not just for prostitution, quite honestly, but also for servitude within Chinatown itself. So they knew the relationship. They had their stories to tell. Many told the story about them being married or having their husband there. But in my book itself, I write about the trial in August of 1874. Very famous trial. It was called the trial of the 23 Chinese maidens. That's the name of the trial. Front page, all week long, about the courtroom trial of all these women, because they were going to be sent back to China. But the American law protected them under the Burlingame Treaty, so that they had to stay. You couldn't ship them back. They had to stay. They had rights. And it went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And it's the first civil rights suit still on the books in the United States. It's called Chui Lung versus Freeman, who was the captain, 1875, from the SS Japan. I write about it. I think it's in chapter 7. But it's a great question because they knew they were coming, and there was all kinds of evidence that was provided in the court that speak to the actual intent and the circumstances that were part of the legal record. And it is the CHYLUNG versus Freeman, 1875 Supreme Court case.
Thank you for that lead, Robert. And on that, we have a series of questions kind of touching up on if they would like to check on the list of passengers themselves, where would they be able to, is that a resource available? And where would they be able to access it?
That's an important question. The primary resource I used was the California Newspaper Project at the University of California, Riverside. University of California, Riverside is called the Digital California Library. And you do advanced searches on that website, and you'll say Chinese immigration. You will pull up the ships, and unfortunately, they don't have the names. They don't have the names. They just say 330 Chinese passengers. So it's an aggregation of the passengers. They will have some special stories from this California site that speaks to the business leaders in Chinatown. The famous delegation that came on the Pacific Mail Steamship that went to Chicago to talk to it's a mercantile exchange. But again, I'll send you the link to it as well, so you have it for everybody. But this is a tremendous resource at University of California, Riverside digital newspaper collection.
Thank you. We'll make sure to add that into our post-program email so everyone will be able to look at it on their own time. Thank you. I think tying together this program, we have some questions asking, Robert, what got you interested in this topic, and what are some of your reflections during and since you've done research for this book?
Thank you. I was posted at the White House. I served as a naval officer. I'm a national security professional. I was competitively assigned. I won the spot to be part of the Bush administration, and I supported the President Bush in 2005, the state visit of Hu Jintao. And during that discussion, that started the curiosity in my mind about how did U.S.-China trade begin. And from that, I found a lost ship. And from that lost ship, 4.5 years later, I put together all the pieces because it had been lost because of the earthquake, put it all together. So I put this story together to tell the truth, tell the story about US-China as well as the immigration. My reflections since then, this has been a very enriching experience for me. You know, I've been at it now for 7 years, telling the story. I enjoy it very much. I met wonderful people in all the cities I've been to. I want to try to contribute to his history and its understanding. So that's my biggest thing. It's a people-to-people story too. It's not like current day politics. It really is looking at the great people and all the different wild geese and the sojourners that came from these different locations. You know, why did they come? What were their human motivations? What did they endure on a trans-Pacific passage? So I still think about that because that's the real world out there.
Thank you, Robert. We have someone asking if you could repeat the name of the case.
Yeah, Chi Lung, CHYLUNG versus VS Freeman, FREEMAN, in quotations, 1875. It's also in my book, on chapter 7. It's got the whole story. It's also in the Daily Alta newspaper. And you could trace this all the way through because the Pacific Mail Steamships that were built that brought all the people across and brought the women over, you know, these became political issues in the late 1870s on the road to 1882. It just didn't happen in 1882. There was all kinds of regulations against the Chinese, up against running different enterprises in Chinatown and so forth. So it was a big deal. So this is a principled decision that was made for the women that they could stay in the United States, and it underscored the 14th Amendment of the United States. It's still used in border immigration law. It was just cited in Arizona 4 years ago. So it all came from this ship, all came from this story.
Thank you. And we are running a little bit out of time. So as the last question, or actually two, the second last question, were the trafficked women mainly there by the will of Anglo-Americans or Chinese Americans in Chinatown?
The research shows that there was through the will of the Chinese merchants. And one of the merchants was in fact Chu Lung in that merchant group itself. This was a big point of contention within Chinese community working with the US government because the 6 companies were the representatives of the Chinese. And they actually wrote a petition to President Grant to basically say the Chinese are good people, that these other groups of people that are bringing this stain on China to America are not representative of us. So it was very contentious, but fundamentally it was the Chinese merchants that were bringing the women over through their negotiations in China and then also onto these vessels themselves. Now there may be more details with regard to how did they get on if you're supposed to clear women of their own free will, but the Pacific Mail Steamships had stewardess on board, American women on board that would take care of the women, and the women were always berthed on the after part of the ship. They were not in the forward part of the ship with the Chinese men. So they believed them if they're going to see their husband. They talked about where their husbands were. The average age was 18 to 22 for the women.
Thank you. And so many compliments coming through from our audience. Thank you, Robert, for being here today. Last question is, what are some of your future projects that you can share with us at this time?
Well, thank you very much. I've got 2 future projects. I'm trying to get this made into a movie, The Titanic of the East, a drama telling the people-to-people story about this ship. I've had discussions with directors and producers, and it's a timing issue. It's also On the documentary side, I hope to get it as part of the National Geographic Drain the Oceans season 5. So we'll see. You'll probably hear more about it. But anybody in the audience that has a relationship with a Hollywood producer that would like this story, that would be helpful. Also, I still would like to get with the San Francisco Giants or with the people from Chinese Historical Society of America to put a plaque, right there where that Buster Posey home run hits. So to signify the importance of China Basin and also where the docks used to be.
And we're really looking forward to seeing how the development of the documentary will turn out, and certainly we look forward to our collaboration in creating a physical plaque of remembrance in this very important place in San Francisco. So, okay, folks, that's about all the time we have today. Thank you, Robert, and everyone in the
You're
audience
welcome.
for co-creating really this conversation today. And please reach out to Robert if you have any leads that could help him in his effort. And if you enjoyed today's program, please do consider subscribing to our newsletter and following us on social media to be in touch with our calendar of events. This month, October, is Filipino American History Month, and we have an exciting intersectional program planned for Sunday, October 17th on the Tinoy Experience, Tinoy meaning Chinese Filipino, where we will be joined by the Baha Tinoy Museum based in Manila, Chinatown, to learn about how the Chinese Exclusion Act affected the Chinese community in the Philippines, a colony of the United States at the time, and their method and story of circumnavigating the Exclusion Act in parallel to the Chinese in America. So join us on October 17th to learn more. And until next time, everyone, please have a good rest of your weekend, and hope to see you all again. Bye bye.
Show.
Yes.
One more thing real quick. For a couple people though,
Mhm.
if you do want to get a hold of me on the website, it's www.southchinavoices.com. www.southchinavoices.com. My email's there as well, but you can certainly reach out to CHSA and also Show. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll make sure to include your email within the post-program email that will go out to all the attendants today. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
All right, bye bye. Take care, everyone.